it's all very well to have these nicely worded treaties, but how do human rights treaties work, and do they work? Are they actually effective in combating inequality and discrimination? How can they help women change the world? We know, of course, there's no international police force to help us implement these treaties, so how do they work? Well, I want to mention 3 different ways that the treaty works. One really important way is that the Women's Convention what it does is to provide the basis for national laws. So here in Australia, our Sex Discrimination Act, the Federal Sex Discrimination Act, adopted in 1984, is really based on the CEDAW Convention. The Australian government, under our Constitution, wouldn't have had the power to enact such a law unless it came from an international treaty. What's interesting is the Sex Discrimination Act is in some respects wider than the treaty and in some respects narrower than the treaty. It's wider than the treaty because the Sex Discrimination Act applies to men as well as to women. So men in Australia can use the Sex Discrimination Act to complain about discrimination against them on the basis of that they are men, and the Women's Convention only applies to women. So that's one way that it's broader than the treaty, but it's also narrower because our Sex Discrimination Act allows various activities to be exempt from its scope, both temporally and permanently. Just one example of a permanent exemption in the Sex Discrimination Act is the provisions that allow discrimination by religious bodies in ordaining, appointing and training priests, ministers and participants in religion, and many religious activities are exempt from having to observe the principle of sex equality. Religious educational institutions also are allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex in the employment of staff. Well, countries can actually opt out of some of the terms of the Women's Treaty by making a formal reservation to its terms. So you can say, yes, we'll be a party to this treaty, but we object to some of the provisions in it or don't think we can live up to them yet. And Australia actually, when we signed and ratified in 1983, we've made 2 reservations to the treaty. One excludes women from combat duties in the armed forces, and the other states that Australia is not in a position to provide a comprehensive maternity leave scheme. I hope that Australia will soon move to remove both of those reservations. And given that now it seems both sides of politics are supporting a paid maternity leave scheme, perhaps that will be possible. Those are Australia's reservations, but some countries have much, much more substantial reservations. And I was quite struck by looking at the reservations of the newest member of the treaty, Qatar, who, as I've said, became a party to the treaty last year. When it accepted the convention last year, Qatar carved out some really serious exemptions to the treaty terms. For example, it stated, yes, we'll sign on to the principle of women's equality. However, we do not accept provisions that women should be equal with men before the law with respect to inheritance laws, because in Qatar, men have priority in inheritance. And also, men's testimony under Qatari law is given more weight than a woman's testimony. If you're a man, your testimony is accepted. You need 3 women to equal 1 man in terms of their testimony. So Qatar has done the rather bizarre thing of saying, we accept this treaty, except we want to preserve these discriminations in our law. Also, Qatar didn't accept that women should have the same rights to enter the marriage as men, nor that women should have the same rights as men during a marriage or once the marriage is ended, or equal rights with men with respect to custody of children. Now, while there's just no question from an international legal perspective that this type of reservation is invalid at international law because it undermines the object and purpose of the treaty, the trouble is there are no satisfactory mechanisms at international law to challenge those sorts of reservations.